scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was an ordinary evening when Peppa and George were getting ready for bed. Mummy Pig had just finished reading them their favorite bedtime story, and Daddy Pig was downstairs watching television. The house felt warm and cozy with the familiar yellow walls glowing softly. But as Peppa climbed into her bed, she noticed something strange. The family portrait hanging on the wall looked different somehow. The smiles on their faces seemed wider than usual, stretching unnaturally across their pink faces. When she blinked, the portrait appeared normal. George was already fast asleep in his little bed, clutching his favorite dinosaur toy. The house grew quiet, with only the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock breaking the silence. Outside, the moon cast long shadows through the windows. Around midnight, Peppa woke up to a strange sound coming from downstairs. It was a soft humming, like someone singing a lullaby, but the melody was wrong somehow. The notes seemed to twist and bend in ways that made her feel uncomfortable. The humming grew louder, and now she could hear footsteps moving slowly through the house. But these weren't the familiar sounds of Mummy or Daddy Pig. These footsteps were different, heavier, and they seemed to drag across the floor. Peppa decided to wake up George, but when she looked over at his bed, she gasped. George was sitting up, but his eyes were completely black, like two dark holes in his face. He was staring straight ahead, not blinking. His mouth was slightly open, and the same eerie humming was coming from his throat. She whispered his name, but George didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward her, and when he smiled, his teeth looked sharp and pointed. The humming stopped abruptly, and the silence was even more frightening. Peppa wanted to run to Mummy and Daddy Pig's room, but as she stepped out of bed, she realized the hallway had changed. It stretched on forever, much longer than it should have been, with doors lining both sides. The family photos now showed faces she didn't recognize. She began walking down the endless hallway, her bare feet making no sound. Each door she passed was slightly open, and from behind them came whispers and voices that sounded almost like her family, but not quite right. The whispers spoke her name repeatedly. As she continued walking, the hallway began to change around her. The yellow walls started to fade to a sickly green color, and the family pictures became darker. The whispers grew louder, but when Peppa finally reached the end of the hallway, she found herself back in her own bedroom. George was lying in his bed, sleeping peacefully with his dinosaur. The family portrait showed their usual faces. However, as she climbed back into her bed, Peppa noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, on her pillow, was a single black feather that hadn't been there before, and from somewhere in the house, she could hear it. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was ordinary morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed her reflection in mirror looked slightly off, moving just fraction too late. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig turned around with her familiar smile, but her eyes seemed darker, almost hollow. "Good morning, Peppa," she said. Yet something about her voice made Peppa's skin crawl. George was already at the breakfast table, playing with his toy dinosaur. But when Peppa looked closer, she realized George hadn't blinked once since she entered the room. His eyes remained fixed on his dinosaur, unmoving, unblinking, as if he were frozen in time. Daddy Pig appeared from behind his newspaper, adjusting his glasses with that characteristic smile. But when he lowered the paper completely, Peppa gasped. His smile was too wide, stretching impossibly across his face, revealing teeth that seemed sharper. "Time for school, Peppa," he said with undertone that made her stomach turn. The walk to school felt longer than usual. The familiar houses looked the same, but the windows seemed to watch her as she passed. Other children were walking to school too, but they moved in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly, their heads turning in unison to stare at Peppa. At school, Madame Gazelle greeted the children with her usual enthusiasm, but her voice echoed strangely. When she turned to write on the blackboard, Peppa noticed that Madame Gazelle's shadow didn't match her movements. The shadow seemed to be writing different words that filled her with dread. During playtime, Peppa's friends gathered around her. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, and Pedro Pony all smiled at her. But their smiles were identical, perfectly synchronized. "Let's play new game, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices blending into one. The game involved standing in circle and staring at each other without blinking. Peppa tried to refuse, but found herself unable to move or speak. Her friends' eyes began to change color, shifting to deep, unsettling red. The playground around them started to fade, becoming darker. When Peppa finally managed to blink, she found herself back in her bedroom. But it wasn't quite right. The walls were same color, but the pictures showed scenes she didn't remember. Her toys seemed to be watching her with tiny, glinting eyes. She ran downstairs to find her family, but the house felt different. The corridors seemed longer, and every mirror showed reflection that moved out of sync. In living room, her family was sitting exactly as they had been that morning, but they hadn't moved. "Welcome home, Peppa," they said together, their voices creating harmony that was beautiful and terrifying. As they spoke, their faces began change. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that moved independently of the clouds outside. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the smiles were just a little too wide, the eyes a little too bright, and everyone was looking directly at her. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making breakfast, but when she turned around, her face was exactly the same as always, yet somehow completely wrong. Her orange dress was the right color, her smile was in the right place, but there was something hollow behind her eyes, like looking into an empty house through lit windows. Daddy Pig sat at the table reading his newspaper, but the pages were blank. When Peppa pointed this out, he just laughed his usual laugh and said everything was perfectly normal. George was playing with his dinosaur toy, but the toy seemed to be moving on its own, walking across the table in small, jerky steps when no one was touching it. The family decided to visit Grandpa and Grandma Pig, but when they arrived at the familiar house, it looked exactly the same from the outside while being completely different inside. The rooms were in the wrong places, the stairs led to rooms that shouldn't exist, and there were doors that opened onto walls. Grandpa Pig was in his garden, but he was planting flowers that were already fully grown, and when he pulled them from the soil, they had no roots at all. Grandma Pig invited everyone for tea, but the teacups were empty even though she poured steaming liquid into them. The biscuits on the plate kept multiplying when no one was looking, and the clock on the wall was running backwards. When Peppa mentioned these strange things, everyone just smiled and nodded as if everything was perfectly normal. As the day continued, more friends arrived for a playdate. Susie Sheep came over, but she kept forgetting things she had just said, repeating the same sentences over and over. Pedro Pony arrived, but he cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. Rebecca Rabbit brought her little brother Richard, but Richard never blinked, not even once, and his eyes followed everyone around the room. The children decided to play hide and seek in the house, but every time someone hid, they would disappear completely until the game was over. When it was Peppa's turn to hide, she found a room she had never seen before, filled with toys that looked exactly like all her friends, but the toys were moving and playing by themselves, having conversations in voices that sounded almost right but not quite. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but the food on their plates kept changing when they weren't looking. Peppa would take a bite of carrots, but when she looked down, she was eating something else entirely. The dining room windows showed a view of the garden, but the garden outside was different each time she looked, sometimes showing places she had never been before. When bedtime came, Peppa climbed the stairs to her room, but there were more steps than there should have been. Her bedroom door was the same pink color as always, but when she opened it, the room was much larger than before, stretching back into shadows that seemed to go on forever. Her bed was in the right place, but there were other beds too, identical to hers, lined up in rows disappearing into the darkness. As Peppa lay down to sleep, She could hear voices coming from the other beds, all sounding exactly like her own voice, having conversations she wasn't part of. The voices talked about days she didn't remember living and friends she had never met. Outside her window, the moon was the wrong shape, and the stars were arranged in patterns that spelled out words she couldn't quite read. Just before she fell asleep, Peppa realized that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today, and the day after that would be the same as well. Everything would be perfectly normal and completely wrong, and no one would notice except her. The voices from the other beds grew quieter as she drifted off, but they never stopped completely, whispering stories of all the other Peppas who had discovered this place before her, and all the ones who would come after. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom. The toys scattered across the floor seemed perfectly normal, but something felt different tonight. The shadows in the corners appeared darker than usual, and the familiar sounds of the house had fallen into an unsettling silence. Peppa noticed that her favorite teddy bear was sitting in a strange position, its button eyes seeming to follow her movements. When she blinked, the bear appeared to have moved slightly closer to the edge of the bed. George, clutching his dinosaur toy, whispered that he heard strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. As the night grew deeper, the children's room began to transform. The cheerful wallpaper started to peel at the edges, revealing something dark and twisted underneath. The colorful drawings on the walls began to change, their innocent smiles turning into sinister grins with too many teeth. Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but her voice sounded hollow and distant, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. When Peppa tried to respond, no sound came from her mouth. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that wasn't there before. The toys around them started to move on their own. Blocks rearranged themselves into disturbing patterns, and the rocking horse began to rock back and forth without anyone touching it. George's dinosaur toy let out a low, unnatural growl that made both children freeze in terror. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open, but nobody was there. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the night light and plunging everything into darkness. In the blackness, they could hear footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. When the lights flickered back on, the room had completely changed. The walls were now covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. The mirror on the dresser showed not their reflection, but something else entirely: shadowy figures with glowing eyes watching them from the other side. Peppa reached for George's hand, but when she looked at him, his familiar face had changed. His eyes had become completely black, and when he smiled, rows of sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light. He spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, asking if she wanted to play a new game that would last forever. The house itself seemed to be alive now, breathing and shifting around them. The floorboards creaked and groaned as if something massive was moving beneath them. The windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but an endless void filled with swirling darkness and distant, haunting whispers. As Peppa tried to run toward the door, she realized that the hallway beyond had stretched impossibly long, with doors leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Each door she passed whispered her name, inviting her to come inside and never leave. The familiar yellow house had become a maze of nightmares, and there was no way out.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, and the familiar sounds of her family moving around downstairs were strangely absent. She called out for Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but only silence answered back. Peppa made her way downstairs, her little hooves clicking against the wooden steps in a rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should. The living room was exactly as she remembered it. The purple sofa, the yellow walls, the television in the corner, but everything felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never come. She found George in the garden, standing perfectly still by the muddy puddles they loved to jump in. But when Peppa approached him, she noticed something peculiar. George wasn't blinking. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, and when she waved her hand in front of his face, he didn't react at all. The other children from playgroup began arriving one by one, but they all shared the same strange behavior. Susie Sheep stood motionless by the gate, Pedro Pony remained frozen near the swing set, and Candy Cat sat unnaturally still on the garden bench. They all had the same vacant stare, looking at something beyond Peppa's vision. As the day progressed, Peppa realized she was the only one who could move freely. Everyone else had become like living statues, their eyes following something invisible that drifted through the air around them. The silence was broken only by a soft humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When evening came, the humming grew louder, and Peppa finally saw what everyone else had been watching. Shadows began to dance on the walls, taking shapes that didn't match anything in the room. The shadows moved independently, reaching out with long, thin fingers toward each frozen figure. One by one, her friends and family began to change. Their usual bright colors started to fade, becoming pale and translucent. George was the first to become completely see-through, like a ghost of his former self. Then Susie, then Pedro, until Peppa found herself surrounded by transparent versions of everyone she loved. The shadow figures grew bolder, stepping away from the walls entirely. They had no faces, just smooth darkness where features should be, but Peppa could feel them watching her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. They moved with purpose, circling around her like they were deciding what to do next. Peppa tried to run, but found that her own movements were becoming slower and more difficult. Looking down at her hands, she saw that she too was beginning to fade. The vibrant pink of her skin was becoming lighter, and she could see through her own arms to the floor beneath. The humming reached a crescendo as the shadow figures closed in around her. Peppa felt herself becoming lighter, as if she was dissolving into the air itself. Her last coherent thought was wondering if this was how all the others had felt when their turn came. The next morning, the house stood empty and silent. The furniture remained in place. The toys were scattered exactly where they had been left, but there was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Only the shadows on the walls seemed different, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move, as if they contained something that had once been much more than darkness. Visitors to the house would later report feeling watched, hearing faint humming sounds, and seeing glimpses of pink figures in their peripheral vision. But whenever they turned to look directly, there was nothing there except shadows that seemed just a little too deep, a little too alive. The episode ends with the camera slowly panning across the empty rooms, while the